Under increasing congressional pressure, the United States government has recently passed the Schumer Amendment, mandating that by no later than February 23, 2024, the National Archives and Records Administration must establish a UAP records collection to gather all government-provided, or government-funded reports relating to unidentified anomalous phenomena, technologies of unknown origin, and non-human intelligence. The legislation also allows for the creation of a second non-public repository of UAP records whose release could be deemed harmful to national security and requires that Congress be notified of any decision to postpone public disclosure of a document. These classified documents will then be periodically reviewed, though the government has a grace period of 25 years from the date of the incident before a review for disclosure is mandated. This move comes as a small victory for UAP advocates, who include amongst their ranks a growing list of very high-ranking government and military officials, as well as prestigious academies. The conclusion that an unknown phenomenon is regularly appearing in skies all over the Earth and that it often poses a flight hazard to aircraft can no longer be ignored. But over 20 years ago, a French defense think tank had already arrived at that conclusion, and as their report makes clear, the extraterrestrial hypothesis can no longer be ignored. The Cometa report, as it's known, was an investigation that drew on government funding that was launched by the Institute of Advanced Studies for National Defense, an organization that regularly advises government officials on defense policy. The participants in the study were all high-ranking military officials or respected academics. This included General Bernard Norlane, former director of the Institute, André Lebeau, former president of the National Center for Space Studies, and French Air Force General Denis Letty. Among other contributors was an all-star lineup of military and police officers, engineers, and specialists in life and social science. The report was prompted by an outpouring of UFO encounters by French military personnel, including pilots as well as civilians. There were significant concerns over both military and civilian flight safety, and no formal investigation into the phenomenon had occurred for 20 years, a pressing national defense and public safety issue. One of the cases investigated and classified amongst the 5% where no reasonable explanation could be found included an encounter with a UFO by a French fighter pilot on March 7, 1977. At about 9 p.m., French military pilot Hervé Giraud, along with his navigator, were returning back to base on autopilot at about Mach 0.9. Suddenly, both men spotted a bright glow coming from their 3 o'clock, matching their altitude and moving extremely quickly and directly toward them. The men feared that they were on a collision course with the object. Both men spotted a bright glow coming from their 3 o'clock, matching their altitude and moving extremely quickly and directly toward them. The men feared that they were on a collision course with the object. Giraud radioed the Contrexéville military radar station and asked if they had any traffic near them. The two men believed the object was another military aircraft on an intercept course in order to visually identify them. Ground radar said they had no track and requested that the men check their oxygen. This is an emergency procedure and indicative that the radar controller thought the request was so abnormal that he feared the crew were experiencing hallucinations due to a lack of oxygen. The object may not have been showing up on radar, but it was very real, and the Mirage went into a bank trying to turn its nose toward the object. In a move eerily similar to what American fighter pilots would report 30 years later just off the coast of San Diego in the infamous Tic Tac case, the object responded to their aggressive 3 to 4G turn by maneuvering toward the plane's rear. With the object behind them and about 1,500 meters away, Giraud suddenly banked left to try to re-establish visual contact. The glowing object moved to his 11 o'clock and rapidly sped away. Bewildered by the encounter, the two men resumed course for their home airfield. But they were both unsettled by the incident, remarking later that they felt like they were, quote, being watched, and Giraud noted to his navigator that, quote, it's going to come back. As if on cue, a similar glowing object appeared at the plane's 3 o'clock again. Either the object had somehow turned invisible and rapidly maneuvered across the aircraft without the men realizing, or a second object was now making itself known. Alarmed, Giraud now felt that his aircraft was in danger from the rapidly accelerating object, and he initiated an emergency 6.5G bank to disengage. The object followed the extreme maneuver easily, settling once more on his tail at a distance of about 2,000 meters. Feeling like the best course of action was to try to turn nose to the object, where if needed it could be engaged, Giraud once more banked sharply into the object, only for it to suddenly dart off in the same direction as the first object and disappear. The plane would go on to land safely, and an investigation into the incident concluded that the object or objects, if more than one, must have achieved supersonic speeds in order to maneuver upon the mirage or disappear as quickly as they did. Yet, despite being nighttime in a quiet part of the country, no sonic booms were reported by anyone in the vicinity that evening. Ultimately, the source of the objects would remain unknown and they themselves unidentified. However, it's curious that just a year later, an Iranian pilot had experienced an extremely similar encounter that had almost ended poorly for him, with a similar glowing object also performing aggressive maneuvers against him. The pilot even felt threatened enough to arm a Sidewinder missile and fire in self-defense, yet the moment the missile was armed, his instrument panel died. Another prominent case investigated in the Cometa report took place in the same year as the Iran case. The case involved French Air Force Colonel Claude Bose when he was a student pilot. On March 3, 1976, he was on a solo training flight in a T-33 aircraft that had him navigate a specific itinerary. Other training aircraft were following along in 5-minute intervals behind him, and the night was dark but cloudless, affording excellent visibility. At an altitude of 6,000 feet, Bose spotted what he initially believed to be a green flare being launched from the ground. The light was nearly at the limit of his vision, but he was rapidly approaching it at over 400 kilometers an hour. What immediately alerted him to the anomalous nature of this object, though, was the rapid acceleration of the suspected flare, with the object shooting past his elevation within 1 to 2 seconds. Suddenly, what he thought was a flare stopped its forward momentum and leveled off at approximately 1,500 meters above him, and then rapidly dove down toward his aircraft. The object sped toward him at an incomprehensible speed, coming close enough to fill up the entire front of his windshield. Believing that impact was imminent, Bose in a panic let go of the joystick and threw his hands up in a reflexive gesture. The object, however, diverted at the last second and sped over his right wing, grazing it slightly as it passed and bathing the entire aircraft in green light. Once back on the ground, Bose reported that the object was about 1 meter or 2 in size, with a greenish tail similar to a comet, though the center of the object had a very bright white light. While the local radar had not picked up anything, 2 other pilots in the same training flight reported seeing the green object as well, corroborating his story. This near collision is a perfect mirror of similar encounters reported by American pilots. In 2014, Navy F-18 fighter pilot Ryan Graves encountered a UFO alongside his flight commander. The object made an aggressive maneuver toward them, passing by at extremely close range. The object was described as a dark gray or black cube inside a sphere, and got within 50 feet of the lead aircraft. The incident was so disturbing that the flight commander called off the training mission and prompted the filing of a safety report. This was not a one-off event, though. Sightings of these objects became so common that they began to be worked into mission briefings. The objects were observed remaining perfectly still in very high-speed winds, then suddenly accelerating to supersonic speeds and performing extreme maneuvers. On January 28, 1994, a flight safety incident involving a UAP ended up drawing the attention of the Cometa Committee. On this day, an Air France flight was cruising at 39,000 feet at 1:14 p.m. on its way to London. The skies outside were largely clear, and the chief steward, who was in the cockpit at the time, spotted what he believed to be a weather balloon. Both the co-pilot and the pilot also saw the object and believed it was an unknown aircraft, though none of the 3 men could identify it. The object appeared to be banking at a 45-degree angle at an estimated altitude of 34,000 feet and approximately 50 kilometers or 31 miles away. The men all recognized that the object must be very large for it to be this clearly visible, which is what prompted the steward to believe it was a weather balloon at first. However, as the men watched the object change shape from a large brown bell to a chestnut brown lens and then disappear completely, that explanation was quickly thrown out the window. A later investigation revealed that the Cinq-Mars-la-Pile Control Center had a radar track on an unknown object that corresponded with the location and the time as reported by the flight crew. The radar track was recorded for 50 seconds and was proven to cross the trajectory of the airliner and did not correspond with any filed flight plan. The object also seemed to disappear from view of radar at approximately the same time that the crew reported it disappearing. The French report also drew upon well-known international cases, including the aforementioned Tehran UFO incident, as well as a 1956 incident at the joint U.S. and Royal Air Force bases of Lakenheath and Bentwaters. On August 13, 1956, radar tracked a UFO moving east to west and directly over the base at an estimated speed of between 2,000 to 4,000 miles per hour. Though no sonic boom was heard, personnel on the ground at the Bentwaters Control Tower reported seeing a bright light flying at approximately 1,200 meters and moving at, quote, an incredible speed. Simultaneously, the pilot of a military transport flying over the base reported that a bright light had just passed below his plane, also at a, quote, incredible speed. Over at Lakenheath, the shift supervisor alerted the radar operators to the activity being detected at Bentwaters. Suddenly, an object was spotted approximately 40 miles away, hovering stationary and at nearly the same axis as the object that had just been spotted over Bentwaters. Lakenheath approach radar confirmed the sighting with its own track, when suddenly the object went from hovering to supersonic speed, making multiple and sudden course corrections that brought it to an abrupt stop for 3 to 6 minutes at a time. The object was tracked going from a speed of 0 to an estimated 590 miles an hour instantaneously. Half an hour later, a Venom two-seat fighter plane was dispatched to investigate the object. Acquiring the target visually and with radar, the pilot reported it suddenly disappearing on him. However, Lakenheath Air Traffic Radar Control Center tracked the object moving 16 kilometers east of the base and put the pilot on a new vector. Approaching it again, the pilot got close enough to radio that his, quote, machine guns are locked onto him. However, the object sped away once more. Tracked by radar, the object had suddenly positioned itself behind the fighter jet and seemed to be following it at a very close distance. The pilot would confirm this as he made visual contact with the UFO now in pursuit. Despite every attempt to shake the UFO, including aggressive steep dives, climbs, and high G turns, the UFO stayed at a steady, constant distance from the aircraft for 10 minutes. Low on fuel, the fighter was forced to return to base, and the object followed him for a while before coming to a standstill in midair. The object now seemed to make several short moves on radar before finally speeding away in a northerly direction. A radar expert on the Condor Commission who reviewed the case would go on to say, quote, if one considers the strong credibility of the information and the coherence and continuity of the reports, as well as their high degree of, quote, strangeness, this UFO case is certainly one of the more troubling cases known to date. Interestingly, nearly 30 years later, a similar incident would occur at the former RAF station in Woodbridge. Known as the Rendlesham Forest Incident, it would also involve the detection of stranger UAP activity, culminating in an American Air Force police team investigating what they believed to be a downed aircraft. However, according to members of the search team, led by the base deputy commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, they encountered a glowing, metallic craft of unknown origin. Halt would famously record the incident live on his microcassette recorder, becoming one of the most bombastic UFO events in history. Similar incidents that occurred in Cold War Russia were investigated, drawing curious parallels to what was being reported in the West. On March 21, 1990, as reported by Aviation General and Air Defense Forces Commander Igor Maltsev, combat aircraft were dispatched to intercept an unknown radar contact. The Soviet Union took UFO detections extremely seriously, given that they were the victims of U.S. spy plane overflights during a significant portion of the Cold War. Upon approaching, the combat jets discovered a disk 100 to 200 meters in diameter, with two flashing lights on its sides. The object suddenly performed an S-shaped maneuver and came to a hover over the ground. Moments later, it sped off at 2 to 3 times the maximum speed of the pursuing aircraft. General Maltsev would summarize over 100 UFO sightings collected by unit commanders thusly. The movement of the UFOs was not accompanied by any type of noise and was characterized by an astounding maneuverability. The UFOs appeared to completely lack inertia. In other words, in one fashion or another, they had overcome gravity. At present, terrestrial machines can scarcely exhibit such characteristics. All the way across the world, though, prominent UFO events were being reported as far away as South America. On July 31, 1995, a Boeing 727 en route from Buenos Aires to San Carlos de Bariloche was preparing to land. Suddenly, a power outage plunged the entire town into darkness, and the control tower working on emergency power instructed the aircraft to stand by for a few minutes before making his approach. Finally cleared for landing, the pilot reported seeing what he thought was a strange star in the sky. Banking away and into an ascending turn, the crew was startled upon completing their turn to discover an object described as a large unknown aircraft flying parallel on their right-hand side. The object matched speed and was described as having 3 lights in the middle of it. As they continued their flight together, the airport suddenly experienced another power failure, causing the approach ramp and the runway lights to go out. The pilots were forced to abort their landing and pull back up into the sky, turning once more to reposition themselves for another approach. The object, now glowing brightly, moved behind the aircraft and, as described by a second aircraft in a holding pattern overhead, suddenly came to a stop and ascended before stopping once more. It moved back in the direction of the landing aircraft and followed it from behind before speeding off toward the mountains. The entire ordeal lasted several minutes and was observed by the pilots, the passengers on the airplane, inhabitants of the city below, and the air traffic controllers, as well as the aircraft lingering in a holding pattern overhead. No official explanation was ever given. The Cometa Committee, however, discovered that prominent UFO events were also being reported by ground personnel. On August 16, 1954, a mass sighting of a UFO occurred in Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar, and was reported on by a former artillery officer and a chief of technical services for Air France. At 5 p.m., Air France personnel spotted a large green ball in the sky moving at a very fast rate. Believing the green ball to be a meteor, the witnesses waited for the imminent explosion as the object disappeared behind a nearby hill. However, a minute later it reappeared and flew directly over the witnesses. The object passed by close enough to be identified as a, quote, sort of metal rugby ball, preceded by a clearly detached green lens-shaped portion that shot sparks from its rear. The ball appeared to be about 40 meters long, and the green lens-shaped portion of the object then separated itself and moved just under 40 meters in front of the object, trailing long greenish sparks from its rear. Passing overhead by an estimated 50 to 100 meters, an estimation made possible by the known height of a nearby hill, the object seemed to cause a power outage in buildings as it passed above them, and it sent nearby animals into an extreme state of anxiety. The craft departed toward the west, and 2 to 3 minutes later, an identical craft was observed above a farm school. Animal herds there also went into a panic, despite being used to the presence of large Air France planes in the skies above. Given that the farm school was 93 miles away, assuming the second object was the same as the first object, then it would have had to move at a hypersonic speed to get there. The object was witnessed by hundreds of people on the ground, split up between the two sites. On December 9, 1979, a UFO was spotted very close to the ground by a Mirage fighter pilot. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jean-Pierre Fartek was living near the town of Dijon, and at 9:15 a.m. he and his wife witnessed an unusual object in the field right outside their house. Fartek estimated the object to be about 20 meters in diameter and 7 meters thick, hovering approximately 3 meters above the ground and in front of a grove of trees known to stand about 15 meters tall. The object was described by Fartek and his wife as being the shape of two saucers inverted on top of each other and did not appear to have any portholes or lights. The upper portion was a metallic gray and the lower portion a darker bluish color, with a perfectly delineated separation between the two halves. The object appeared to be in constant motion, almost as if trying to remain balanced and upright, and it did not make any noise nor cause any turbulence on the grass or the ground. Fartek and his wife observed the object for an unknown amount of time when suddenly it began to oscillate faster, with it appearing to tilt slightly forward in the same manner as a helicopter as it takes flight. Suddenly, the object moved away at a low altitude and in extreme speed, making no noise and leaving no presence of its passing behind. On later investigation, Fartek's neighbors and their children all confirmed witnessing the same object. Back to Russia, a compelling case involving Russian ground troops drew the attention of the Cometa Committee. This incident occurred in late July 1989 and was originally recorded by the KGB and later declassified after the fall of the Soviet Union. The account was recorded by a KGB agent and includes 7 written testimonies from witnesses who observed the event from 2 different sites at the same base. Sadly, if there was any radar data gathered, it was not included in the report. On the night of July 28th to 29th, multiple UFOs were spotted by soldiers at a distance of between 3 to 5 kilometers between the hours of 10:15 p.m. and 11:55 p.m. 3 objects in total were observed, with one moving silently and in very jerky movements, abruptly starting and stopping to hover. At some point, the UFOs must have been detected by radar, though such data is missing from the KGB file or was not declassified along with the parent report, as an interceptor sped out of the night sky toward one of the objects. The UFO was observed to move at what was described as such incredible velocities that it made the intercepting fighter jet appear to be standing still by comparison. Despite breaking the sound barrier, the only sound the soldiers heard was the roaring of the intercepting jet's engines. Later that night, 2 other soldiers testified to witnessing another UFO between 11:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. in the morning. The UFO was described as a metallic disc approximately 4 to 5 meters in diameter and surrounded by a brightly lit hemispherical dome of some sort. The witnesses observed the silent craft move over a missile depot where it shot down a phosphorescent green light while approximately 300 meters away from them and 20 meters above the depot. The beam of light seemed to move across the storage structure as if scanning it, and a security response team was dispatched but did not approach the silent object. Instead, the security team, along with the 2 original witnesses, observed the craft as it hovered over the facility for approximately 2 hours, never once making a noise. This account was especially compelling, given the similarity between this account and reports of UFOs over American nuclear weapon sites. Famously, UFOs were spotted hovering over active Minuteman nuclear missile silos throughout the Cold War, and occasionally bathing the silo below them with a similar beam of light, as if scanning the contents of the silo. An outside observer may be tempted to claim that the Russians may have simply been a victim of copycat hoaxing, but the extreme secrecy of the Cold War and a lack of communication between the East and the West would make it almost impossible for the average Russian soldiers to have ever heard the UFO incidents over American facilities. Which begs the question, how and why do Cold War Soviet UFO encounters so perfectly mirror those that occurred on the American military sites? Sometimes, though, the committee investigated cases of actual alien beings. One such case occurred at Valensole on July 1, 1965. A local villager, Maurice Massa, left his home at 5 a.m. to go work on his lavender fields just outside of the village. As he was about to start his tractor at approximately 6 a.m., though, he heard a hissing sound that drew his attention. The sound came from behind a small hill at the edge of one of his fields, and he moved to investigate. Upon clearing the hill, he was surprised to discover a small craft about 90 meters away from him in his lavender field, which he described as a pill-shaped vehicle similar to a Renault Dauphine. The vehicle stood on 6 legs that had a central pivot point that they attached to, with a large tube protruding from under the belly of the craft and into the ground. Massa had no inclination that the strange craft was alien, and instead thought that it was a weird vehicle being used by thieves who were after his lavender. He approached the craft stealthily, and when he got to within 10 meters of it, he spotted 2 small beings on the other side of it, described as having large, pudgy heads and white skin. One of the beings aimed a tube device at him, and he was immediately paralyzed on the spot, unable to move as the beings entered the craft and flew away. A subsequent police investigation discovered the site where the craft had allegedly landed, complete with indentations in the soil and puncture marks from the tube described by the farmer. It seems a slam-dunk case, except for a few problems. First, Massa had not reported being paralyzed to the police in his initial report. Instead, he stated that he had seen one of the alien beings inside the craft through a clear dome-like covering, similar to that used by the famous Jetsons. That being spoke to one outside the craft in a guttural language, which prompted it to run inside, and the craft took off. A month later, he reapproached the police to change his story and included that part about being paralyzed. This is problematic, and it's cast a significant doubt on Massa's story. If it was a hoax, it's unclear why Massa would return a month later to contradict himself and add more details. But the fact that that type of craft described by Massa is rarely ever described anywhere else also adds doubt to his story. A far more credible case, however, occurred just 2 years later. On August 29, 1967, at about 10:30 a.m., 2 children were watching their family's herd as it grazed. The young teenagers were alerted by their dog that one of the cows was about to jump over the stone wall that lined the perimeter of the family's field. Running off to chase the cow away, the boy was surprised to spot 4 other children on the opposite side of the road the field sat next to. He called his sister over, and the 2 moved for a closer look, as they knew all the children in the village and were curious why any of them would be out here. No sooner had he called for his sister, though, that he noticed an extremely bright sphere back and away from the unknown children. Approaching closer, the 2 realized that the figures were not children at all, but rather small beings standing no taller than 1.2 meters. 2 of the figures were standing close to one of the other figures, while a third was kneeling in front of it, its attention occupied by something on the ground. A 4th noticed the children and turned a mirror-like device toward them that blinded them. They called out to the beings, but they quickly ran back toward their sphere, levitating up to the top of it and diving inside of it head first. The children weren't at an angle to tell if the sphere had an opening at the top or if they moved through the sphere itself as they entered. The bright sphere gave off a loud hissing sound and then rose up to the sky in a spiral pattern at a very fast speed. A strong odor of sulfur filled the field in the wake of the craft's departure. The family contacted the French gendarmes, with one arriving promptly and investigating the site where the alleged sphere had sat. There he found many small prints and testified to the very strong odor of sulfur. The children's father, mayor of the town, also testified to the children smelling of sulfur when they had ran back home. As the investigation widened, another witness who had been at a nearby granary stated that he had also heard the strange hissing sound, dispelling any notion of a helicopter being involved. According to the family doctor, the children's eyes were affected by the blinding device used on them, which caused their eyes to water for several days. Allegedly, the children also suffered psychological distress after the incident. The French report goes on to detail many other UFO reports investigated by their team, local law enforcement, or the military. While some criticism has been levied against the report due to methodology in specific cases, the inescapable conclusion is that the same phenomenon reported globally was being reported by the French witnesses as far back as the 1950s. It's these similarities between global reports that indicate the presence of a global phenomenon of unknown origin, and the skeptical assumption against it relies wholly on ignoring physical and radar data and claiming that every single witness throughout history has been lying or a fool. Hardly a credible explanation. Now go check out UFO Chased a Military Plane, or click this other video instead.